I'm happy to co-chair the second session of the of today's training. It's called Member States Request for PRAC Advice. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the co-chair, Geraldine Portier from the EMA. Geraldine is a pharmacist by training and have a master's degree in regulatory affairs. She's been working at the EMA for 10 years, including 7 years for the CHMP Pharmacovigilance Working Party Secretariat, and since 2012, work with the PRAC Secretariat. Geraldine worked in the pharmaceutical industry previously, mainly in the EU regulatory affairs. My pleasure to give the floor to Geraldine, who is going to introduce to the other speakers. Thank you.
So good afternoon again. I'm delighted to chair this session with Ying. I think no need now to introduce again the chair of the previous session. Today, the session on Member States' request for PRAC advice is aiming at presenting to assessors the framework for Member States to request the PRAC advice in the remit of the committee. So the format, objectives, and steps to follow to request such advice will be described, and you will also be given some real examples. The first presentation, that is named Member State Request PRAC Advice, a practical guide for Member States, is going to be presented by my colleague Vanessa Fradin Da Ros. So just to give you a bit of background, Vanessa is a pharmacist by training with an MNC in regulatory affairs. She's been working at EMA PRAC Secretariat since June 2016, so we actually work together. Previously, Vanessa worked in the pharmaceutical industry, mainly in the worldwide regulatory affairs and clinical development, and this for 10 years. So now I give her the floor. Thank you.
So, good afternoon again. Today we'll be describing the path to request PRAC advice from Member States. So the aim of the presentation is to optimize collaboration between the Member States and the PRAC, and to provide the procedural framework when a Member State can request a PRAC advice. This is a very loaded slide that will aim at summarizing the remits of the PRAC. It's from the rules of procedure. Overall, and mainly, PRAC gives recommendations such as for referral, PSUSAs, or PASS. PRAC can, PRAC endorse PASS protocols, is consulting on the URD list and the list of medicinal products under additional monitoring, can advise Member States or CHMP on specific issues. So for today, we'll be discussing mainly the Member State request for PRAC advice that is, according to the remit of the PRAC, on RMPs, risk management systems, renewal, and safety type 2 variation on nationally authorized products. So when can Member State request PRAC advice? Some example. I will not detail the example because this is the target of the following presentation. But this kind of presenting the type of PRAC advice is what you will find in the agenda of the committee. So in the section 11, you will find the Member State request for PRAC advice for safety-related type 2 variation of marketing authorization or other topics. In the past few months, we had, as example, for the safety-related type 2 variation, a request from Sweden regarding a variation procedure for Hidrasec Racecadotril with regard to interaction with angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors and angioedema occurrence. This will be described in the following presentation. You had also a request from Belgium regarding a variation procedure that was ongoing in Belgium for Daonil, libenclamide, relating to the risk of cardiovascular mortality. This one also will be described further on. And on other area, you had from the Netherlands. So there is a mistake in the printout that you have with you. It was not France, but Netherlands that requested this PRAC advice. They consulted on the need for further risk minimization measures, in addition to the risk minimization measures that were adopted as an outcome of completed referral procedure under Article 31 for valproate and related substances. So in that case, if you want further insight of what was the advice and its context, you could refer to the November meeting minutes. No, to the July meeting minutes, sorry. And the thing is just that in UK, following the referral, there was decision to include a warning on the auto-labeling of valproate medicinal products and to distribute a patient alert card. And in France, there was a decision to put a pictogram on the auto-labeling. That were all those additional risk mitigation measures were not part of the referral, so it was discussed at PRAC level. And another example is the UK request for PRAC advice on the evaluation of a study on the impact of benzodiazepine on short-term mortality, recently published in European Psychopharmacology. So for this example, you could refer to November meeting minutes of the committee. So when are we not in the case of a member state request for PRAC advice? When we have no scientific question that is asked to the PRAC and no member state position. So because it's not to the PRAC to say to a member state when it is a signal or when harmonization is needed or what kind of procedure should be followed nationally. There's no ground also for PRAC advice to be given to a member state if there is no scientific analysis provided by the member state requesting the advice. The committee needs to get a proper scientific analysis on the issue to be able to debate clearly during the committee. So non-injured information circulated that would be presented with no analysis of collected data through this NUI will not be sufficient for the PRAC to discuss. And providing historical background of what happened on a product and not providing scientific analysis will not allow the PRAC to give advice back to the member state. How could a member state request a PRAC advice? The PRAC needs a member state request form. So there is a dedicated form to be filled in and sent to the PRAC secretariat well in advance of the meeting, and the form should include the question of scientific nature for the committee to consider and the member state position on the issue. For instance, if we go back to the example of the UK request for advice for benzodiazepine, the publication was clearly analyzed, and the UK position was that there was some limitation to the study, and no conclusion, no sufficient evidence could support the supposed increased risk of mortality. And the PRAC had to say if they were in agreement or not. But the question was clear, and the scientific analysis was provided. To be attached to the form, the PRAC needs an assessment document with a scientific analysis of the issue in support for the PRAC plenary discussion. So this is the request form that is used afterwards to give the advice to the member state. And so you'll see there is a need for background, clear question identified to PRAC, and the time frame for addressing the issue at member state level, and the documents that are enclosed in support. When do we need to receive the requests? Well, the agenda for the PRAC closed the Tuesday the week before, so this is the latest day we need to receive it. Obviously, if it's received a little bit before, if there are any issues in the way the assessment document or the request form are addressed, then it helps to get time to go back to the member state, refine the question, and still include the request in the agenda of the meeting. At the time of the PRAC plenary meeting, well, the order can vary, but usually the member state request for PRAC advice is scheduled to be discussed on the Monday of the PRAC, so first day of the PRAC, together with referrals and oral explanation, and this DHPC request for PRAC advice. You will have a presentation afterwards on the risk-based criteria to define if there is a need for plenary discussion or if whatever the outcome of the PRAC, if it can be silently agreed, but in the case of the member state request for PRAC advice, it is automatically for plenary discussion. There's no silent agreement on this. The scientific assessment is presented by the PRAC member of the member state requesting the advice. The PRAC advice to member state is adopted at PRAC on the last day of the meeting, so usually it's a third day. No further step at any other committee is anticipated. I mean, not anticipated, but there is no further step at any other committee, no adoption by CHMP or presentation at CMDH. And PRAC advice is fully disclosed in the PRAC meeting minutes that are published on the EMA website. The PRAC outcome for the request for PRAC advice is the adoption of a PRAC advice to member state by the PRAC. Though there is no direct formal making decision phase, it is an advice, so it is not legally enforceable. It's up to the member states to follow the advice, the one that requested the advice, but also maybe some other member states that would like to apply the advice. It's up to them. If there is no regulatory procedure ongoing at national level, nothing such as type 2 variation, then there is no legal mechanism to ensure application of the PRAC advice. And so to be reminded, PRAC advice is not an alternative to a signal procedure. It's different. It's not usable for harmonization exercise. And it's not to be seen as a regulatory or procedural guidance that would be given by the committee. You can find useful information on templates in MMD folder, where the current template of member state request for PRAC advice is available. So it's in the part of the coordination of scientific committee regarding PRAC, general area, PRAC templates, and section 11, as I said, other safety issues by member states. The template for PRAC advice to member state is based on the request form for PRAC advice. There is just addition of a discussion and conclusion at this advice sections. And that will be all for this presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for your presentation. We will take the questions at the end during the Q&A session. So I suggest that we move to our second presentation, focusing on request for PRAC advice, and we will get some real life examples presented by Qun-Ying Yue. Thanks very much, Ying.
Thank you, Geraldine. I will mainly talk about examples for the member state request for PRAC advice. But at the end, I just mentioned a CHMP request as well. The first example, as Vanessa already mentioned, is request for PRAC advice on glibenclamide by our Belgian colleagues. Glibenclamide is an anti-diabetic agent. It has been approved decades ago. It's widely available, I think, in 90 countries. The concern is increased cardiovascular mortality, as shown in a meta-analysis in 2015. The variation about the findings was already approved in SPC 4.4 in some member states, but not yet approved in some other member states, including Belgium. One member state has circulated NUI, non-urgent information, where a letter from the Diabetic Scientific Society has questioned if the other products in the same class as a glibenclamide could have a lower risk for cardiovascular mortality. It was also reviewed in the PSUR procedure, but as mentioned, that PSUR procedure is not suitable to harmonize because the timeline is very tight. It's not possible to make a deeper review. There's no clock stop. So one way to have a deeper analysis about the safety issue is to find a member state to ask PRAC advice. The questions to the PRAC is that is the SPC change needed based on the available information? And another question is the 4.4 SPC text proposed by the company acceptable? This was already approved in some member states. And the text says epidemiological studies suggest that the administration of glibenclamide in comparison with the metformin or glycoside is associated with the increased risk of a CV mortality. And the risk was mainly in patients with coronary artery disease. To make the long story short, the PRAC outcome was that PRAC endorsed the Belgium assessment report. It's quite thorough on this meta-analysis. According to the review, there was clear limitations in the meta-analysis. For example, there are 17 studies included, 7 randomized clinical trials, 17 observational studies, but there are no stratification by type of the study or quality of the study. And there are also different kinds of confounding biases, like there are a lot of missing information, clinical measures not possible to be provided, and the consequence of the missing information were not discussed either. Selection bias or information bias, and so on. And there are also inconsistencies in the included studies with the follow-up duration, design of study, type of patients, new patient prevalent users, and a number of heterogeneity. So as the author stated themselves, that the mortality may be increased. However, the findings are exploratory, that is hypothesis generating. And this cannot be used as a support for the SPC update. And in addition, there has been a newer meta-analysis that includes randomized clinical trials. It's a bigger study, and that raised doubts on the increased mortality for glibenclamide. So based on the review, the PRAC considers by majority there was no sufficient evidence for further regulatory action for glibenclamide. So this is one example that the PRAC gave scientific advice, and as Geraldine already mentioned, the procedure is not for harmonization because there's no procedure to follow the implementation. However, it did help to harmonize because if you have the advice with the scientific evidence, you could make a decision nationally. The second example is request, also member state request for PRAC advice on Racecadotril. Racecadotril, the product name is Hidrasec. It's indicated for symptomatic treatment of diarrhea. The safety concern is interaction between Racecadotril and AC inhibitor with regards to angioedema risk. There are already different variation procedures in national agencies in France, in Germany, in Austria. The interaction already dealt with in different variations with different SPC wordings. And also in the PSUR regarding for AC inhibitors, there are also texts for SPC 4.5 agreed at the PRAC level. It says AC inhibitor angioedema risk may be elevated with the Racecadotril. So the question is there a possibility to harmonize for all the Racecadotril products as well as for AC inhibitors? And one way to address this issue is to find member states that have a variation procedure, as the previous example. And in Sweden, there was ongoing variation, type 2 variation for Hidrasec. So Sweden has requested PRAC advice after assessment of the variation. To make the story short, the company has discussed the mechanism for the angioedema induced by AC inhibitors and induced by Racecadotril. Both products affect the bradykinin degradation, but at different places, at the different steps. The lead member state, Sweden, has reviewed the data and recommended that the 4.5 agreed by PRAC for the AC inhibitors could be recommended as well for Racecadotril. And there is already some existing text for 4.4 text on the angioedema and the management of angioedema. And this could be acceptable as well for Racecadotril. However, the company wanted to contraindicate for Racecadotril in patients who had a history of angioedema while on AC inhibitors. And the company has not provided sufficient data to support that. So the question to the PRAC is that does PRAC agree with the lead PRAC member recommendations with 4.5 okay, 4.4 could be okay, 4.3 not okay at present. So the PRAC agreed with the list of questions in the variation procedure. So we will come back to PRAC when we have addressed the company's response again. The goal is that with a PRAC advice that should be evidence-based, could be possible to be implemented for all the Racecadotril and OC inhibitors. Now I just want to mention one example on the CHMP request for PRAC advice. Geraldine has mentioned the remit of a PRAC. I think you remember, yeah? The PRAC remit, what they are. PRAC responsible for signal assessment, for PSUR assessment, for PASS protocol assessment, and referral assessment. But for safety variations, it's usually the CHMP that is responsible. But sometimes CHMP would like to have a PRAC advice, for example, when there is a DHPC. In this case, it's about telaprevir. It's a product for hepatitis. And it's well known this product can give rise to serious skin reactions. In this case, the company has submitted a type 2 variation, want to update 4.4 and 4.8 because of new cases of TEN, fatal cases. And the company would also to send DHPC direct healthcare professional communication. And with the key elements in this DHPC, one is to state PEG interferon co-administration, co-treatment may contribute to this rash, to this serious skin reaction. And also in the existing SPC, the management of a severe rash could be made more clear. So PRAC is asked to give input for the DHPC. And you know, in PRAC, in addition to the members from member states, there are also experts from healthcare professionals, from patient representatives. And there are members who actively provide input, dedicated members, on the DHPC, on the contents, the key messages, but also on the communication plan. In communication plan, there are details on the target of the communication and on the timing. With regards to the direct healthcare professional communication, there are detailed guidelines in the GVP 15. It's on communication. It says EMA coordinates the DHPC review as appropriate, so to involve PRAC. And PRAC is always involved in the review of DHPCs when it's related to the safety concern that has been discussed at the PRAC. But EMA may request advice for PRAC, from a PRAC on issues related to other safety communications. So in addition to the remit of the PRAC, PRAC can be involved through the member state request or CHMP request for advice. So these are just a few examples. I think I stop here and to see if we have questions.
Many thanks, Ying, for this presentation. I think now we can actually open the question and answer session. So in the room, and again to remind all remote participants, you can send us emails with your questions.
It seems we have a lot of time, yeah? We are ahead of the schedule. So do we have any questions from the webinar people? Any written comments, written questions?
Actually, we would like to ask you if you experienced at national level the assessment of variation, for example, and you considered consulting the PRAC. Because having European advice, I think, can also reinforce your position at national level. Have you ever considered asking PRAC some advice?
Hi, this is Tanya from Norwegian Medicines Agency. I haven't really considered asking PRAC for advice yet, but I did have a variation assessment not very long ago, where the applicant was, they wanted to do some changes in the safety sections, and it was sort of based on a single SIR assessment, but in the single SIR assessment final assessment report, it was only stated that that the company needed to do some further work, and it would be discussed again in the next SIR assessment or SIR period. And then the company decided to just send in some data and get a review. And it didn't, to me, it didn't seem like they had changed a lot since the SUR discussions, and I was sort of wondering why they were submitting this on a national level to us. So I ended up asking the lead member state for the single SUR assessment on their view, and I'm actually waiting for their response. But I was wondering if that sort of question might be something we could also ask for PRAC advice. Because, I mean, if something is discussed in single SUR assessment and there's been a thorough discussion around it, and you have a lead member state who's very familiar with the problem, I think it's very... Well, it's not really good to assess this on a national level, and you might get different assessments in different countries on something that's already sort of been started on a European level.
Yes, I didn't quite catch what was the problem that was discussed in the SUR.
The problem was that the application that was submitted nationally to Norway, and the company said they had also submitted the application nationally to other countries, but not used work sharing or anything. The application was really based on discussions that was done in the SUR single assessment, in the final assessment report, on a problem discussed there. So I would think it would be better to continue discussing this problem on a European level and not on purely national levels in the different countries, and whether we could ask for PRAC advice in such instances. That's my question.
I just want to make it clear to myself. In the SUR procedure, the PRAC has recommended product information change.
No. In the SUR assessment, or final assessment report, it was stated that more data was needed, and then the company was supposed to discuss this in the next SUR, but instead they discussed it earlier and then just submitted it on national levels instead of taking it to the next, on a European level, or using work sharing or something, so that you could still assess this for all countries instead of on purely national basis.
But the submission is not in a variation procedure, or is there any procedure?
It was submitted like a normal type 2 variation, but it was in many countries at the same time. Yeah. But
Well, in that case, because we did have some experience with different variation outcomes coming from a single PRAC recommendation, so this is quite odd, and we try to avoid this maximum because it's not our preferred option, of course. So if you have a procedure coming from a PRAC recommendation or from a PSUSA, where in your case we stated, okay, this issue needs to be monitored for the next PSUR, and the marketing authorization holder proactively submits a variation, our advice would be for you to seek PRAC advice through the CMDH, if we are talking about mutual recognition, decentralized or national products. And if this also happens with a centralized product, because we also had cases in the past, then we should liaise with CHMP in this case. But yes, it would be desirable to have a single and unique recommendation, because otherwise we would fall in the inconsistency again.
Yeah, it's a quite good example for PRAC advice. More comments? Yes, please.
But we have the same problem. We have had the same problem in the Czech Republic with metformin Zentiva, which is at a more advanced stage than yours. And exactly the worst thing happened, because just before the end of PSUSA, Zentiva submitted about 6 signals in 2 different countries as RMS, and plus some national authorizations, and Germany was one of the RMSs and accepted, I think, all of the signals and changed the SMPC 4.8, but we have not accepted any of the 6 signals because we assessed it the same way as the PSUSA RMS, which is France, and so now. But I'm not sure this is a good case for asking for PRAC advice. This is more a procedural issue for us. So we hope we will take it to CMDH because this should be solved through work sharing in our view. And there is nothing scientific about it because PSUSA was scientific and it just ended. So what would PRAC do in this case?
Well, from our experience, what we try to do, at least in Portugal, we have a very strong connection between the members of the 3 committees. And we have meetings every 15 days. And all the issues that we see in the PRAC meeting that could be flagged to the CHMP and to the CMDH, we do that. And we count on the members to cascade the information for their departments, because what usually happens is that PRAC is within the pharmacovigilance department, and then you have CHMP and CMDH in the regulatory department. So tight communication is highly needed, and we try to do that. But if you see or you could try to give the information to the assessors that if they see an issue like that, that they should go to the respective committee. Because if it is a regulatory matter indeed, then yes, I agree, it should go to the CMDH. Because if it is a simple procedure issue, then it doesn't need to come back to the PRAC. But if you think you would need to seek for a scientific discussion, if you want the issue to be further assessed or thoroughly analyzed from a scientific point of view, I would advise then to go to the PRAC. So it is a case-by-case situation. We do not have a single standard procedure for these kind of advices, because it really depends on the situation. So I think that's it.
And would you recommend approaching the other RMS who is evaluating the same type 2 variation to do a sort of informal work sharing?
Yes, I'm not a CMDH expert at all, but from what I know from my colleagues, when we do have this kind of situations, they do go to the other member states and they try to do, as you are saying, kind of a work sharing to have some consistency, because otherwise each member state will approve their own wording, because the assessors are different with different points of view. So they try at maximum to take this issue into the CMDH to try to reach a work sharing variation, or at least a common understanding on what the approval will be.
I'm very happy to have you here. You know, Margareta is in the GPAC group and is an expert to deal with the SUSA problems and also with harmonization issues. I'm quite happy you are here. Thank you. Some comments, written comments from webinar people? No? And Jane, please.
Thank you. I was just trying to think of any examples where we've asked for PRAC advice, and I don't think this was one that we did, but I think the Netherlands did. And it was a new study on ovarian cancer with HRT, which suggested a slightly higher risk than we already knew about. But because there was already warnings in the product information about ovarian cancer and HRT, it didn't really sort of affect the benefit-risk balance as such. So a referral wasn't the right way to take this forward because it's a whole class of drugs. And we wanted to have an outcome that would apply across all the HRT products. So the only way that I think the network could think of to sort of review the study, come up with a single conclusion and then apply it to all HRT products was through PRAC advice and CMDH as well. And so I think that was one really good example because we really couldn't think of any other way to do this. The only downside is that, of course, doing that is not legally binding. So the fact that a variation was requested, you know, it's up to the companies then to do that voluntarily. But it does, I think, highlight that it's almost like there's a gap in the legislation. If you want to take class action without actually sort of having something that really affects the benefit risk, it's really difficult to do it unless you do it through a non-legally binding procedure.
Yeah, you need a procedure, binding or not. Yeah. Yeah, I think the possible request, as Geraldine already mentioned, is the RMP, yeah, for the nationally authorized products. If member states has questions, and safety variation, that's quite common. And
one of the first slides of Vanessa is actually referring to the PRAC rules of procedure, and in fact, the reference of the document is mentioned, I think, at the bottom of the slide. I think it's quite important to be familiar with the rules of procedure because I think it will really give for any assessors at NCA level the type of questions that they can put to PRAC. So I think indeed like risk management, anything around risk management plans, risk minimization measures, and variations would be probably the most typical examples that we get through a member state request for PRAC advice. And indeed, any, as it was also highlighted, any regulatory questions would actually not fall under the remit of such a PRAC advice because the nature of the questions need to be scientific. PRAC won't be able to say if it is a signal or if a referral should be triggered. This is not what we are actually expecting through a member state request for PRAC advice. But of course, I mean, if there are any questions, we are very happy to receive them, and we can consult internally. Maybe in the future, we will even have a group dealing with this type of questions. And I mean, don't hesitate to email the PRAC secretariats. I guess you have also other contacts here at EMA. And if you actually consider to put a member state request for PRAC advice, the earlier you do it, the better, because we have indeed a deadline, as Vanessa mentioned, on the Tuesday before PRAC, but it gives little time actually to digest information and potentially come back to you as PRAC Secretariat, but also as other PRAC delegations to comment on your requests. So the earlier the better. I think the discussion is more fruitful.
Well, just remind that PRAC outcome, there are two kinds of PRAC outcomes. One is a recommendation, one is advice. PRAC give recommendations for the referrals, for the imposed past protocols, for the PSURs, and for the signals, yeah. And the PRAC advice is issued for this sort of a request, and also for RMP. Even though it's advice, it helps member state quite a lot because it's scientific scientifically sound. It's evidence-based, so it's help a lot for the CMDH. Yeah, this sort of advice. But for the recommendation, that is legally binding. So the company has to implement the outcome of the PSUR, the outcome of the signal, outcome the imposed path and referral. Of course, the PRAC recommendation will come to other committees. For the centralized product, the PRAC recommendation will come to CHMP. For the purely national products, the PRAC recommendation will come to CMDH. And if these committees do not agree with the PRAC, you know what will happen, yeah? They have to justify by writing and publicly why they don't agree with the PRAC. Otherwise, the PRAC recommendation will be implemented. Further questions? We still have time. Take the opportunity.
So far we haven't received any questions by emails, just to update all the participants. So don't be shy, you can send us an email, but apparently I think someone wants to put a further question. Oh, Zana.
Could you please highlight how PRAC advice, this outcome becomes available to all stakeholders and to member states and CMDH and marketing authorization holders?
It will be in the minutes or PRAC minutes.
So yes, as Ying just mentioned, this will be definitely in the minutes. The only issue is that the minutes are published a long time basically after the actual discussion, because they need to be adopted at the following meeting, and then it's actually a long process to completely finalize them. But basically the advice is addressed to the member states. So we actually expect the member states that requested advice to transfer the advice, and I think they will actually include it in their conclusion of any assessment and will communicate with the MH. But from our side, a practical position, we actually have all the adopted document in MMD, and the MMD folder for each PRAC plenary meetings are meant to have all the adopted documents the Tuesday after the end of the plenary meeting. So all delegation having, all PRAC members have access to this MMD folder, and a number actually of assessors have also access at national level, but you can go at any time to retrieve the full advice. And as mentioned, it will be anyway, we will have a short summary in the minutes.
And I think PRAC will collaborate with the CMDH for the nationally authorized products. If the outcome concern a lot of products, a lot of companies, I think a CMDH could help to implement the PRAC advice.
Oh, can I?
No, just to give you a very practical example, the last time my CMDH colleague requested for a PRAC advice, what happened was I brought the issue to the PRAC as the PRAC member, presented to the PRAC. It was regarding a risk management plan, and we were not sure because our Dutch colleagues, it was paracetamol combined with tramadol, and our Dutch colleagues were quite unsure of the risk minimization measures, if they were sufficient or not to address the potential risks of overdose, medication errors, etc. So we brought the issue to the PRAC. the PRAC adopted a set of risk minimization measures, and then what happened was I gave the input to my CMDH colleague, and then she presented at CMDH. So usually this is how it goes. Inside the member state, we should liaise in order to all the colleagues from both committees to have the feedback.
And actually, to mention to you, after each PRAC, we prepare some slides on the main highlights of the meeting. And the PRAC scientific lead, who is Peter Arlett, will present for information this information to CHMP and CMDH on the first day of the meeting. It is actually for information, as I said. So we put always routinely all the PRAC advice to member states and to CHMP, even if they are, let's say, low profile, but to make sure that we keep a link between PRAC and CMDH. That said, after a PRAC advice to member states, we expect the CMDH colleague of the PRAC delegation from the member state that requested PRAC advice to request a slot for discussion at CMDH if it is considered necessary. So I think it's important indeed that after the PRAC delegates communicate with their CMDH counterpart, and then this information can be channeled to CMDH as needed.
More questions, thoughts? I'm just wondering, for the PRAC advice, the most common procedure is a safety variation, yeah? But the other procedures that you can ask for PRAC advice could be leg, MIA.
Well, this terminology would be used at CHMP level because it's for centrally authorized products. But of course, CHMP can also request PRAC advice for post-authorization measures. And the equivalent at national level would work if there is a framework for assessment, because we still expect an assessment report. This is really important. PRAC cannot get half a page of PRAC advice and decide if something should be labeled or not, because they still need to have a scientific discussion behind. And actually, I think it was well said in the presentation, there is an assessment, and I think usually the member state will request, is PRAC in agreement with the conclusions or not? And of course, if not, what else would you suggest? But this is the common questions we would like to get. Yeah, and at national level, of course, any safety variations and any questions falling under the PRAC remit can be put forward to PRAC. I think it's also mentioned actually in the rules of procedures, the renewals, because renewals are based on the need for an additional renewal is based on pharmacovigilance grounds. So this one can be also considered if you need to put a request to PRAC.
Yes, it's not just to get advice. You have to work very hard to get this advice.